Hello and welcome to our second edition of Inside Iraq Special, here from George Washington University in the heart of the American capital. My name is Jassim Azzawi. 4 years ago, when President Bush embarked on his war on Iraq, critics charge major American newspapers, TV networks, and news organizations abdicated their traditional role of rational inquiry and critical investigation. Instead, they had become involved in promoting and spinning the president's message and his war plan, some content. But when the war dust settled, horrific images Welcome back to our second edition of Inside Iraq Special here at George Washington University. I'm joined by a group of experts representing the American government, the media, academia, and think tanks. And we would like to thank very much Professor As'ad Abu Khalil, who had to leave us. Inside Iraq talked to the American people. We went to the street and we polled some of the opinions about the Americans, what they think about the newspapers. Here's what they said.
I feel at the beginning the American media was clearly sucked into the government and Bush administration line, was really into this cowboy mentality that everything was going to be gung-ho and all done up and mission accomplished and all that crap. And they really fell apart in terms of investigating the weapons of mass destruction. They went along with the lines as far as the weapon of mass destruction.
I think personally they were biased more towards the government. They always say, they lied to us or they gave us certain information, but not all the information. So personally, I think they were biased towards the government.
I think that the American media was put in a very compromising situation. I think they put themselves there.
I think people and the public look back now and ask, why didn't you tell me that? Why weren't you more critical? We'll see if they learn their lesson, though, or not.
I think the American media always is going to have the American perspective of the war. We're always thinking our intentions are good. And in that way, it's definitely valuable. Fox News reports a lot that you won't see on Al Jazeera. Is that fair? I don't know. I think it's fair to get both perspectives.
I feel like it's been on the government side in terms of the Iraq War. I don't feel that there's been enough dissent and enough for the American public to understand the situation in Iraq, especially before we went into the Iraq War.
The American people talking to Inside Iraq and venting perhaps their anger about what happened. Let's take a few questions from the audience. I'm joined here by a question from Josh Rushing, our own. Go ahead, Josh.
My question's for Mr. Fernandez. Much like you, I served the government long enough as a U.S. Marine that I served different administrations and yet had to hold the party line. Yet in serving this last administration, it became much more difficult for me to hold the party line. Do you find yourself challenged in a similar way?
Well, I think that's the goal of any public servant, is you always have to weigh internally, personally, the trade-offs that you make, what you're willing to stand for, defend, or not. It's a very personal decision. It's easy from the outside to say that person's a hypocrite or that person's a liar or they're exaggerating. But as I said, it's a personal issue, one that one has to weigh very carefully. There are policies of the U.S., I'm not talking about this administration per se, there are policies in the last 23 years of my time in the government that I certainly did not agree with and would not defend, and I made sure that I avoided going anywhere near that country or that issue. I'm not going to tell you what those are, but that's that's a very much a personal decision, and if you get paid by the government and you're paid to do a job, and your responsibility is to do that job as well as you can, and you have to live with your conscience and with your worldview and moral view, and that's the bed you made, and you have to sleep in it.
Michael Isakov, in February 2003, when Secretary Powell presented this country's case for war against Iraq, the world somehow was aghast about the flimsiness of the evidence presented, none other than by the French Foreign Minister de Villepin and the rest of the world. People in this country, they thought, what a powerful presentation, what a wonderful case. Powell sealed the fate of this decision. The war is going to happen simply because of his stature.
Well, I don't think it was quite as neat as you presented. I think there were people in the United States who were not overwhelmed with Powell's presentation, who raised some questions about it at the time, and I think there were people internationally, as Alberto said before, who were fully backing the war and saw Powell's speech as presenting evidence. I think, like almost everything else, you sort of drew what conclusions from the speech you had from where you were starting with. But look, the Powell speech, when you go back and look at it today and realize what was underlying it, is really, one of the, it's going to be a historical moment as one of the really sad chapters in American diplomacy, and certainly a really sad chapter in Colin Powell's biography, because it's not just a few things that he said that were wrong. It's just about everything that he said that was wrong. There was a point in the speech when Powell was trying to establish the case for the sinister nexus between Saddam, Osama bin Laden, and weapons of mass destruction. And he talks about the claims, about the story of an al-Qaeda commander who has now been free to tell his story, and how he knew how bin Laden had sent 2 operatives to Iraq for training in chemical and biological weapons. There it was. The evidence finally was in the United States government's hands. Well, we have since learned, since the war, about where that came from. It's a big part of Powell's speech towards the end, and it was a particular detainee who was rendered by the CIA from Afghanistan to Egypt.
You're talking about here about Sheikh Libby, who was tortured.
Saleh bin Sheikh al-Libby, who, after the war, is returned to U.S. custody and talks about how he was tortured by Egyptian security services. Not a shocking thing to the United States government. The State Department Human Rights Reports every year has cataloged the credible reports of abuse by Egyptian security services when it comes to terror suspects. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libby recants the whole story after describing how he was brutally treated, and says, look, I had to tell them something. They were torturing me. I had to fabricate a story that would satisfy them. And that's the kind of intelligence that was used by the Secretary of State of the United States in the United Nations to present a case to the world for war. It's a really shocking story.
Some of that dissension and some of those doubts you mentioned, Michael Isikoff, they were reported by many American newspapers, but they were not reported on the front page. They were reported in page 18 or 21. Was that simply because the case was already made, or was that somehow there is a mischievous machination to it? What's your explanation?
Look, this is insidious here. Colin Powell gave a presentation before the Security Council that took our nation to war. There's no doubt about that. That was closing the deal domestically and closing the deal abroad. He was wrong across the board. You would be challenged to find anything of substance he was correct about in that presentation. Now, we are in Washington, D.C., where we have the most well-connected media the world has ever seen. I mean, we've got people that have Rolodexes that can call up any inside source they want and get the true scoop. He was wrong across the board. Yeah, there was the little smiddling here and there of concern in the American media, buried. But overall, the American media gave Colin Powell not just a passing grade, but a stellar grade. I mean, we had op-ed after op-ed after op-ed saying, slam dunk, he nailed it, made the case, it's a done deal. Wait a minute. Are you journalists or are you cheerleaders? Because what occurred was cheerleading.
Thank you, Scott Ritter. We're going to take another questions. We have somebody from the audience. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming out today. I really appreciate you speaking about a very important topic. I'm wondering, we've been talking about the role of the media over the past 4 or 5 years we've been in Iraq. And I'm wondering, in particular for Mr. Isikoff, what role will the media play in the next few years in Iraq? Will they be more of the cheerleader type or more critical? And more importantly, will there ever be a headline in Newsweek magazine that says victory in Iraq without a question mark? Thank you.
Well, I cannot foresee the future and tell you what our headlines are going to look like a year down the road, but I'd have to say at this point, the idea of victory in Iraq looks problematic at best. It's hard to imagine what a victory at this point would be. You know, I think the best we can hope for is a relatively expeditious American withdrawal that doesn't leave the country in complete chaos. And I think if we can achieve that, it'll be proclaimed a victory, but it'll be far short of the way people imagined a victory 4 or 5 years ago. As far as the role of the media, look, of course, we've learned that we should have been more aggressive prior to the war. But I do have to take exception a little bit to some of what Scott's saying. It was more than a little quibbling. There were quite a few stories that challenged aspects of the administration's case, but some of what we now know. Scott speaks with great certainty about some of this. This was very gray at the time. The particular story I just cited, you didn't know in February of 2002 when Colin Powell said that. I didn't know it. It was known within the bowels of the CIA about Ibn Sheikh al-Libi.
Being tortured.
You did not know.
But I could make a fantastic educated guess that there was no link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein.
But you could make a guess, right? And certainly on the aspects
an educated guess.
Excuse me, on associations between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. That was one that I was quite aggressive, I and others were quite aggressive in reporting and challenging aspects of the administration's case. I think I and my colleague Mark Hosenwald will take no backseat to anybody in the fact that we wrote stories from center that challenged a lot of what was being said, particularly the completely phony story about Mohammed Atta in Prague meeting with an Iraqi intelligence agent. I pretty much debunked that story in May of 2002, citing conclusions by the FBI and the CIA. And what's amazing is Dick Cheney continued to suggest that it was true. That, I don't know what more you can do. You can write, it's not true, and then have senior administration officials, continue to cite it and just say, look, they're wrong. That's not what the FBI believes. That's not what the CIA believes. That's not what the evidence shows. But the full depth of the story, such as the one I just mentioned, was not known, was not publicly known. And if there was a way I could have gotten it at the time, I would have done anything to get that story out.
Thank you, Michael.
But we learned it later.
Just a quick thing. Did Newsweek, when Dick Cheney repeated the lie in August, come out and say this is a lie?
Well,
or did they replay his words and give it credibility? And is Newsweek going to run a headline that says Iran's nuclear weapons program with a question mark?
Yes.
Or is it going to continue to run stories that
No,
the administration?
We have. You can't just continue to assert that we publish things that are the opposite of what we do publish. In fact, we have raised repeated questions about the administration's claims about the Iranian nuclear program.
Michael, let me stop you for just a second.
It's there.
Let me take one more question.
Take notice of it,
from the audience.
Take notice of it, but there's always separated by a gap. Instead of Dick Cheney says X, and we know this to be false, it's Dick Cheney says X, and down here we have questions about it. That's not really
We have a question
reporting.
now, Scott Ritter. It comes to us from Laurie. Go ahead, Laurie.
Well, first a comment, because I think the media is getting a bum rap for a large part of the coverage in Iraq. I think you distinguish between the media who are in Iraq and the media who are in Washington. U.S., European, and Arab media have risked their lives, some have lost their lives, trying to honestly portray the realities of Iraq. And I think they've learned their lessons here in Washington about believing every word that comes out of the administration. And my question was going to be following up on Brandon's question, looking at coverage now of the saber rattling toward Iran, the Iranian threats, towards Syria, Iraq and its neighbors, the whole Gulf security issue. Do you find, I'd be curious about your estimate of the more aggressive stance on the media in questioning what is coming out of the administration or what's coming out of the region.
Before he answers, may I just ask you to identify yourself, please, Laurie, and who you are with?
Right, I'm communications director for the Middle East Institute, but I was a former working journalist in the Middle East and I was in Iraq.
Thank you, Laurie. Go ahead.
Well, look, there's no question that probably the worst legacy of the of the experience in Iraq is that the American government now has so little credibility on these issues that their assertions are not accepted by the public and they're not accepted by most of the news media. As I was saying before, I think my publication and others have been extremely skeptical particularly in some of the more recent claims about Iranian nuclear programs and Iranian involvement in Iraq. And the problem is that, you know, the intelligence may well actually be stronger now in some respects, particularly on Iranian involvement in stoking some of the violence in Iraq. But because it's simply administration claims, I and others, I think, are extremely reluctant to just accept it at face value. They've got to show more of it.
That being the case, Michael Isakov, simply once bitten, perhaps twice shy.
Sure.
Is that the case for Iran? Joshua Moravchik, I read an article for you where you are saying that I am going to hold the President Bush to his words that we will not allow Iran to become a nuclear power on his watch, and he has to keep it and he has to do something about it.
Yes, you did read such an article by me, because I wrote such an article.
Would that be a case to strike Iran, and would the American media play ball?
This thing about the American media is absolutely bizarre. You know, it's funny because here we are on a news outlet, Al Jazeera English, which is a non-American news organization, which in this very program shows much more bias than we're accustomed
to seeing. That's what you say.
Well,
we'll leave it to the people when they hear it. Because once you say that, as if you are making it reality, leave people to judge whether we are biased or not.
If you don't interrupt me, I'll explain. Not only did we start out with the hyperventilating, but we started the second segment with interviews of American citizens. And we had 6 little snippets of interviews with American citizens.
You're not saying we actually doctored this. You know, we brought people who have
if you want to know what I'm saying, let me say it, then you'll know.
Go ahead.
5 of the 6 agreed with the premise of this program. Now, if we have public opinion polling of what Americans think about the war in Iraq and what Americans think about the American news media and what Americans think about the reporting of the American news media about the war in Iraq, and the proportions who say the media was complicit or are not at all reflected in the 6 people that you chose to put on the screen, nor is objectivity present in your own questions that you've put to me and others. So why don't we get off this media stuff? If you would like to talk, and finally, but before we get off it, the point I made at the beginning is unchallenged by anyone. It can't be, which is the media is now against the war, and we're still at war. The media in the United States does not control anything, and it is immense and immensely varied. Now, if you'd like to talk about Iran on the substance, I'd be very glad to.
No, actually, I don't. You know, I just mentioned that to find out where perhaps the American media will stand for. But since we are talking about the public opinion,
for anything. The American media is thousands and thousands of different news organizations, different reporters, different commentators who make a living by arguing with each other.
You well said. But Scott Ritter, on the eve of the war, millions of people worldwide, including in this country, they protested against the war. Now there is a national tilt within this country in order to pull the troops out, evidenced by the November election and Congress now calling for the troops to be withdrawn. Will that be reflected accurately in the American press and the media?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, first of all, we're saying millions of people in the street. Never forget we're a nation of 300 million people. And so let's say we actually put 2 million in the street. There's 298 million people that weren't in the street. So we have to be careful about throwing numbers out there. As critical as I am about the American media, I'm even more critical about the American citizen. You know, the American citizen has basically abrogated their responsibilities of active citizenship based upon the preamble of the document that defines who we are and what we are as a nation, the Constitution. One begins, we the people of the United States of America. The media can say what they want, but the media is never going to be held to account, just like politicians are never going to be held to account unless the American citizen gets engaged, gets actively involved. So I have a hard time saying, is the American media going to do the will of the American people? The majority of the American people are unplugged. They're not tuned in. Even if the media is as multifaceted as you say it is, it's irrelevant. Because how many Americans actually tune in and watch the media and get informed by the media? The majority of Americans are largely ignorant of the world we live in today. And that's where the media does a disservice, because instead of putting out hard fact, putting out a multiplicity of ideas, the media gives credence to an administration that has disgraced itself with its inability to tell the truth about any subject whatsoever. We talk about the media against the war. I don't know. The last time I took a look at what the media says, give the surge a chance. Give this surge a chance. Let's not prejudge this outcome. It was widespread opinion that we needed to give the surge a chance, regardless of the fact that the American people voted in November to put a Democratic Congress in power whose policy priority should be withdrawal of troops from Iraq. So I don't agree that the media is against the war. I think the media continues to give this administration, which has a record of lying and deceit and misleading, a free pass when it comes to articulating policy, and it doesn't provide an immediate counter to the obvious faults of this policy.
Let me take a response from you, Joshua.
Well, I think I didn't say the media is against the war because I don't want to talk the way that Scott talks, as if the media is one blob that all moves from here to here. The media is very mixed now, as it was very mixed all along. I think it's quite true that in 2003, there was a tilt in the media toward accepting the administration's arguments, and I think it got a little, actually, the moment where it seemed to me there was a more noticeable tilt was when the war began. There was a kind of identity. Someone in the lead-in referred to embedded reporters. Some of our reporters who were out there in the field with our soldiers felt a kind of loyalty, I think, to the soldiers more than to U.S. policy, and reported things in a very kind of sympathetic way to from the view on the ground of what U.S. soldiers were going through. And I think today, the majority of news reporters and news organizations, like the majority of American citizens, are critical of the war. And the thing that I've been saying repeatedly that's completely opposite of Scott's view is that you look at the media as sort of one thing that does X or does Y.
Final question to Alberto Fernandez. Since you are representing the government and you attacked Al Jazeera, Jazeera got it right, the U.S. government got it wrong.
Jazeera has been wrong many times on Iraq and on many other issues.
You would say that, wouldn't you? But on the war, we got it right. Let's not quibble about that. But since your job is in the public diplomacy, how much are you affected by the legacy of the 2003 war?
First of all, I think that I have to agree with Mr. Moravcik on some of this. It's so easy to simplify. It's so easy to generalize about this issue. The media, first of all, media in Iraq, U.S. media and international media has been heroic, has done some excellent reporting, has done excellent stuff. I have a friend of mine who was an American journalist for 3 years in Iraq in the red zone. You know, without being embedded, without being in the green zone, doing tremendous reporting from there. So it's very easy to cast stones. It's very easy to criticize. Look, historians are going to judge this outcome. I personally, and if there's a thread here which I strongly disagree with, is I'm personally more concerned about the future of Iraq than debating the Colin Powell speech or all of this. I'm worried about the suffering of the Iraqi people today. And so the surge, hey, I hope the surge works. I hope the surge works perfectly, because it's not just American soldiers there. It's 26, 27 million innocent people who are there who deserve a better future. And you know, it's very easy to kind of get into the blame game, but we need to think of practical solutions about Iraq. And Al Jazeera, by the way, and Al Jazeera Arabic especially, are experts in the blame game. They love that. They love to throw stones, but they don't like to talk about their own complicity in so many things, both before and during the war. So yes, we need criticism about the American media. We need criticism about the U.S. government, but there's plenty of criticism to go around in the Arab world, with the Arab press, and including this station.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, perhaps on everything said, but except Al Jazeera did not go and invade Iraq. Alberto Fernandez from the U.S. State Department, thank you very much. Michael Isikoff, author of Hubris and investigative journalist with Newsweek, thank you. Joshua Moravcik from the American Enterprise Institute, thank you. Former UN weapon inspector Scott Ritter, thank you. That's all the time we have for this edition of Inside Iraq Special from the heart of the American capital. Join me next time on a special edition of Inside Iraq. Goodbye.